Hi there. This is Matisse with the History Project. Welcome back. This is our oral history live for Fag Rag. This is part two. So if you haven't gone to watch the first part, maybe take a pause and go watch the first half of this. We're really excited to bring these folks back to talk about the important history of the publication of Fag Rag. I'm going to pass it over to Mark, our host, who's one of our public historians. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Matisse. I just want to kind of agree with you in that I hope that people will go back and look at the first part, especially if you're younger. If you're younger and you're watching this and you're wondering, like, who are the heroes in our movement? You're looking at some heroes in our movement right here. So you have an opportunity to get to know them a little bit as people and also as activists, literary people, and people who were there from um, the first beginnings of this important publication, which started in 1971. And we're talking about Fag Rag. And we have people who were here from the very beginning. Fag Rag lasted from 71 to 87. And in fact, it lasted far longer than a lot of publications in the queer community then. There were a lot of bar newspapers and bar magazines and things that would come and go, and they were great. But they didn't always last. It was tough financially and otherwise. But how I'm going to ask the first question I'd like to ask is do you think how do you account for the longevity of Fag Rag lasting from 71 to 87? Shannon in the first part mentioned that Fag Rag's anarchistic spirit might be responsible for its longevity, but maybe it's other things as well. Michael, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think it's important to realize that even though it lasted 16, 17 years, there were years when we published nothing of that. Charlie used to joke that we began as a quarterly, meaning 4 times a year, and occasionally we were every 4 years, right? But I think there are actually several really important reasons why it lasted so long. One, and we'll get to this in a minute, talking about the anarchism, right? But that we actually didn't have a structure, right? So it actually molded with the times, it actually morphed with the times, and it always brought in new people. I mean, literally over 16 years, the people at the end, there were a few people who were involved from the beginning. But I think, right, that it really responded to what was happening within the culture in a very open and forthright and uninhibited way. And then also it was shocking, right? I mean, we actually went places, we actually crossed those lines. We actually said, Christianity is the enemy. Charlie burned a Bible. I just want one more thing, that it lasted because Charlie Shively was a mainstay. But I really want to hear what everybody else has to say.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that Charlie was very much the thread from the beginning to the end. But Charlie's anarchic style really fed the creativity of everybody who came through the door. Although some of us may have been there longer, there was never a sense of seniority or that somebody had to be given permission to join. There was room for everybody at all times. And I think that's just in the spirit of anarchy that Charlie and the founders intended.
Yeah, I mean, and anarchy sort of style and approach and the theme, I think, was critical to where we were. And it was very much part of the spirit of what was happening at that particular time, late 60s, early 70s, where in general people were, at least people on the left, and given that we were all fairly young at that particular point, this idea that people should not be kind of placed into hierarchies. We didn't own our ideas. Ideas were a collective kind of pursuit. So there were no bylines in the beginning. The first couple of issues had no bylines. So, I mean, it was very much kind of we're in this together and we want to basically transgress any idea of structure and hierarchy.
And would you define anarchism that way as not having structure, not having leadership? Kevin, would you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we were, and again, can I remember exactly how we were talking about it? No, I have to confess I don't remember, but it just seemed like it was so much a part of what was happening contextually at that particular time.
It was in
You
the
know,
zeitgeist then.
it
You were
was very much
just to remind people, you were there at the very first issue.
correct, correct.
And was there an explicit understanding this is going to be an anarchistic endeavor?
I mean, I actually had participated, apart from Fag Rag, in some anarchy readings and discussions, but I don't remember us actually using that word, in the Fag Rag meetings. Maybe Mark might have some memory of that. Again, I think as you're saying, Mark Crone, that it was part of the zeitgeist. We didn't want structure. We didn't want, we didn't want hierarchy. We didn't want, no one owned their ideas. Again, they were collective ideas.
Yeah, I was there
I,
from 78 to 83, and the word anarchy hardly ever got mentioned. But I think it was in the spirit of things. There was just a place we showed up. We did things. People talked about the magazine as long as they were interested in it. And once their interest faded, they were someplace else. But it wasn't a hardcore, this is anarchism, and we're sticking to what people define as anarchism.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't, again, I wouldn't say it was anarchism that was driving it. We didn't know. In the very first issue, there was an open letter to gay brothers that sort of said, this is who we are. We hope you join us, but we really didn't know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's anarchistic with a very small a,
Mhm.
even though Charlie was actually a scholar, a like professional historian of anarchism with a big A, right? But certainly the impulse was anarchism with a small a,
So it
and
seems
at
like
times very small.
it seems like being doctrinaire about what you were was a kind of a death knell of a lot of organizations anyway, right? Back then, this seemed like it wasn't very self-conscious. People were just
People
doing
were
it.
just there. It was very organic. And I think that organizations fail often because of hierarchy and disruptions in
Mhm.
hierarchy and battles within hierarchy. And that just didn't exist in Fag Rag.
Yeah.
I got there initially in 1976. And as Maya said a moment ago, in the mid 70s, nobody was saying we are anarchists. I think maybe if we were saying we are anarchists, that would be not in the spirit of anarchy.
Yeah.
We specifically didn't define ourselves.
I'm interested in the transition between not having bylines and having bylines.
Mhm.
Michael, do you have a memory of that and how that was navigated?
You know, my memory of it is that it happens around issue 4 or 5, and I believe, and this is what we can talk about this later. So where some tensions come up. I believe, like John Mitchell and Steve Abbott wanted to have their names on their articles, because they wanted to because they actually wanted to be professional writers and they wanted credit for what they wrote. And the discussion as it evolved, right, was, that's fair, but it's also fair that people take responsibility because, in one of those early issues, Steve Abbott and John Mitchell did an interview with Gore Vidal, and Charlie wrote a rather nicely worded
Scathing.
but stinging rebuttal saying Gore Vidal's a rich white man who comes from an aristocracy in America and he doesn't need us and we don't need him. But we printed it.
We printed both.
Both, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Was that issue 5, Michael? The Gore Vidal?
5 or 6, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
5 is the one where 5 is the only one where we didn't use the Fag Rag, the traditional Fag Rag logo. It has that sort of quirky, blocky sort of look, not the sort of fancy.
the sort of Helvetica look.
Yeah.
Let me guess,
I think it's also
Mitzel
important
did that.
to say that oh, you mean the blocky look?
Yeah.
I believe it was my then boyfriend Jim Davis who wanted to
Oh.
do it because he wanted to make it different, and people sort of agreed, and nobody liked it, and we didn't do it again. Also, there are people from the beginning. I think of Alan Young, who would, who I respect enormously, but who would never say that he was an anarchist. He's a leftist.
Mhm.
And Andy Kopkind was not an anarchist, So we may have functioned on anarchistic impulses with a small a.
Yeah. I
But there are
think
plenty of
that,
people who would never say that they were anarchists.
yeah, I think if I remember back to sort of the culture and the community we had, the notion that we would call ourselves anarchists just really wasn't part of our culture.
Yeah.
Maya, were you going to say something before?
It was a half formulated thought about Charlie's role. And I guess in Mitzel's role too, that even though we were anarchists, for me, everything followed on what Charlie could do and what he suggested and what the knowledge he had was. And he never closed off anybody's opinion or anything, but for me, it was Charlie's show. And and he let me come in and be part of it.
And I think you say something very important, Maya, in that, yeah, Charlie was sort of the thread that was always there, but he never stood in the way of anybody doing what they wanted to do in Fag Rag. I mean,
That's true.
As long as it didn't go, completely against our principles, what few principles we had.
Yeah, what principle? Yeah.
Right. Although I would add to that it was really I totally agree. It was really a case of passive resistance because he normally got what he wanted eventually, even though he actually allowed people to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
And in the case of the Gore Vidal interview, they did what they wanted and Charlie had a response.
And I think John Mitzel said that he had a friend whose mother was a phone operator at the Ritz, and Gore Vidal was staying there because he was on a book tour in Boston for one of his books. And she did something that they were not supposed to do. She put the call right through, and he picked up right away. And they said, "Hey, do you?" And he goes, "I'll meet you downstairs." He was quite available. Shannon, we were going to ask about, in line with all this. Do you remember any big disagreements or anything that might have threatened the existence of Fag Rag?
I don't know that threaten the existence was ever in play, but there certainly were conflicts and there were heated discussions. I mean, we all had egos, we all, although we were a very cooperative, collection of people, we all had our quirks and we all had our our demands of ourselves and others. I don't remember anything that threatened the organization, but we did have an incident one time where in a fit of pique, one of the collective members destroyed the paste up pages, the pages that went to the printer. So
the boards.
The boards, yeah, and so the pages had to be rearranged, and we had to sort of rejigger that issue. So there was drama. There would be drama now and then, and every now and then somebody be drunk and act out, but just like everywhere else in Boston at the time, But I don't think that the organization, oh, it's a bad word for it. I don't think that the collective was ever in jeopardy, and I don't think that the paper was ever in jeopardy. But yeah, we certainly had, you put a bunch of queens in a room enough days in a row, you're going to have conflict at some point.
How did you handle? Did you have any Maya? Did you have any hotshot types who, you mentioned that some people wanted their names on things because they wanted careers, but how did you handle somebody who said, this is all wrong. I want it to be more traditional, or did you have anyone like that?
No one who was in there was going to say, well, we want this to be more like the Advocate. I mean, it's like, you knew it wasn't the Advocate. You knew you were coming into something, And for me, there were heated things and people were stoned or drunk or coming in, and and me too. But and there was a wonderful sort of jealousy things between people like Freddie and Mitzel. But the main thing was, and I think this is what Charlie added, was that it was always funny. It was always funny. I have never laughed so hard in my life, and that took over a lot of things. And even when people were being cat bitchy, like Freddie and Mitzel could do, it was still hysterical. And that sort of changes everything. I mean, that's what I remember the most about the group, was just how hard we laughed.
And often, if somebody had a really strong opinion about something, it was generally not about the entire collective or the entire issue that we were working on. It was about whatever project they were working on, so whatever article they were laying out or designing or writing themselves. And if you had really strong feelings, you were left to do what it was you wanted to do, and it became part of the whole. And I guess that's anarchic in its own way.
Also, the collective was very, excuse me, was very fluid. So some people came for a while. Many people, they're like, thinking of Mark and Kevin, were there from the beginning and then moved on with their lives and moved to San Francisco or moved to other places. And also some people, I can think of two people who were there for a bit and sort of didn't like how things were going, or didn't get their way, or had different opinions, and they just sort of drifted away, and there was no hostility. They weren't cast out.
Right.
But it was always, the collective was always reshaping itself.
The more we talk about the longevity and the glue, and you've already mentioned, or other people have mentioned, that Charlie was this. It seems like Charlie was the glue, and
Yeah.
maybe I'm not remembering. Charlie was also, I mean, he was a professor at a college. He was older. He had money, which we didn't have. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, he was literally the adult in the room.
Yeah.
And well, Charlie was not an aggressive or hostile or controlling individual by no stretch, but somehow he had some something about him that kind of just kept it all together. I don't know. Do other people agree with that?
Mhm.
Oh, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And he
part
was
of what
so
he put on the oh, I'm sorry, Mark, you go.
he was just so giving too. I mean, I remember he just gave us his car. There was
Yeah.
no, don't do this or don't do that. You
Yeah.
need a car, take it.
Yeah, Charlie promoted an environment where everybody was welcome. If you wanted to do something, if you wanted to participate, there was room for you.
Yeah.
I also get,
I was just, I think it's really instructive to, I don't mean to badmouth this other person, but look at the differences between Fag Rag and Gay Sunshine. And Gay Sunshine began as a collective, and it was, like Fag Rag, sort of functioning, dysfunctioning, whatever. And Winston Leyland essentially sort of, took it over and did an amazing job putting out 50 issues of that incredibly good quality, right? But it was his paper. It really was Winston Leyland's Gay Sunshine. And there was no staff, it was only Winston.
Yeah.
And that was never the case with Fag Rag or with Charlie. Right. I do want to say that one thing that Charlie insisted, the only rule I remember from layout was that, and it was a hard and fast rule, you could never put anything like a can of Coke or a glass of something on the layout table. For obvious reasons.
And
That was
I'm
the only
assuming
rule.
that was connected to one issue where a can of soda was dropped
Yeah.
on the
It
boards.
just makes common sense too.
I get kind of that feeling from all of you too, though. You're pretty collaborative seemingly, unless you've mellowed. It seems like you fit into this group pretty well.
I think that was the underlying spirit of the
Yeah.
collective, was welcoming. There was an open door. Anybody could come in. you know, and anybody who didn't fit in, just as Michael said, they drifted away, you know, never animosity. There was never any fight that resulted in someone leaving, you know, it's just, it's very organic, very organic.
And also, I mean, for Mark and Kevin, how many of those people on the first issue or the first two issues drifted at, there was no fighting, but how many of those people drifted out of town?
Yeah, no, I don't remember. I don't know if you have a better memory than I, Mark, human, but there was no fighting. I don't remember any tension. It seemed
Yeah.
like it all, and I think, we were starting it was brand new. So I think the novelty, the mission, kind of drove us and kept us together. And what Mark said about Charlie, his generosity, I think really was very, very critical, at that particular time.
Well, certainly poetry was a big part of Fag Rag, and Maya was going to speak on something about good gay poets and also John Wieners, who was a significant poet. I remember watching Allen Ginsberg one time on television. I don't know if I mentioned this the first time. I probably shouldn't say it because I may have mentioned it, but bear with me. He said there is a great poet in Boston, and it's John Wieners, and I had never heard of him. And I was so impressed that he said this. And then I met John Wieners, and it was an interesting experience. But Maya, do you want to talk about John Wieners and about poetry in general, Fag Rag?
Well, I don't know a lot. I wasn't really involved with the good gay poets.
Okay.
And I knew John Wieners. Yeah, I came to him late too, but I was a big fan of the Beats and I had read his stuff back then. And most of what I know is the stories Charlie told. And I'm not sure how true any of those were, but they were great stories. And basically, John Wieners, according to Charlie, he had a scene in an airport where he ran after Ted Kennedy with a pillbox hat on, and he got hospitalized and he got a lot of electroshock. And it was clear when I met him that he'd had a lot of electroshock and that Charlie kind of took care of him. And they put the one book out that had children of the working class. That was really just this, that's the poem I remember. But he would bring John around sometimes, and John had wispy hair, egg on his shirt, and mostly talked in whispers, but could be very clear sometimes, talk about it. But I would sort of intimidate him because I wanted to hear what he was saying. So I always had my head close to him and stuff. And he would be whispering stream of consciousness poetry, like Marilyn Monroe with Sense on Diamonds to Gloria Swanson's Crucifixion. And it would be lines like this just spilling out over and over and over again. And it was just so wonderful to hear. And we traveled with him once when we were getting Fag Rags out, and we did little play productions. And Charlie and I were doing something from the play Folie à Deux, and John Wieners just stood up on stage and said, I am the blessing angel. I absolve you both. And he starts picking us up by the arms. And there was just all this stuff like that with him that, I mean, his personality was really still in there and he was really troubled, but Charlie was really there to take care of him.
Yeah.
And he told another story that John Wieners lived in a little rent-controlled apartment by Mass General, and according to Charlie, every month he would get rid of all his furniture, rip up all his poetry, and buy stuff from thrift stores and start again. I have a friend in Santa Fe who would see him in the lobby of the Ritz Hotel in the mornings. And she was walking by and she would see this man with unkempt hair in pajamas, with footies sometimes, with a Dunkin' Donuts coffee, sitting in the window of the Ritz Hotel reading the paper. And she became dear friends with him. But this was sort of who he was at the end. And he never stopped writing. And I don't know what got saved and what didn't get saved, but I'm just so glad to have been around someone like that and then read the great poetry he'd written before.
Yeah, we were very lucky. I think there were 2 trips that we made with John, and we would do these Fag Rag trips in Charlie's car where we'd load up the car with the with the newspaper, and we'd drive to between Boston and Washington, and we'd stop at all the gay bookstores and drop them off, and we'd visit people. And, you know, John and Charlie both knew people who were sort of big names in gay liberation, or big names in poetry, and then we would visit Maya's friends or my friends, and John was just a fascinating person to travel with, because although he did have the style of acting crazy, he was more lucid than he let on. And when he was interested in a conversation, when he was interested in a topic, he would talk to you like this. You
Yeah.
know, he could turn it on and off as he chose. And that's part of the fascination of him, because he sort of lived this poetic lifestyle where everything was on his terms. Everything was on his terms. And I don't know how often we published John's poetry. Don't think it was in every issue. I remember one issue in particular in 79 or 80 where we published 2 of his poems. But we always hoped to get poems from him.
Yeah, actually, there were quite a, because I'm writing an article about Charlie and John now, so I've been going through the Fag Rag. There are actually a lot of issues that
Okay.
poems are in, or prose pieces, or as Maya pointed out, Jackie Kennedy wore the jewels of Elizabeth Taylor and raised into heaven, prose pieces. But I think what's really interesting is that John was a fairly notable beat poet.
Mhm.
Had terrible, had a heroin addict, a heroin addiction, electroshock therapy, horrible psychiatric drugs, and really was not considered a poet anymore by the poetry community. And Charlie, through his really an incredible amount of, for all of Fag Rag and Charlie, of community care and of, what people now say mutual aid, right? I mean, John's poetry was in Fag Rag and kept him going. And we published Behind the State Capitol, which was spurned by most of the other poetry people, and now it's considered his best work.
A masterpiece.
So Charlie really, and it really was Charlie. John couldn't have come to those meetings on his own.
Right.
Yeah.
Or gone on trips, or,
Right.
I mean, I know John Wieners used to make it to see John Mitchell at the bookstore to actually cash his disability check.
Yeah.
And that was, what he could do.
And, stepping back to the larger discussion of poetry at Fag Rag, it was a massive part of what we did. And in some ways it was community service, because for so many young gay men or gay men who were not in urban settings, them sending their poetry to us was a major life event for them. And that's why we had a policy of always trying to find a poem or 2 from each submission that we could include. And it would be interesting to know what the average number of pages of poetry were in each issue, because it was quite high.
Yeah. So I actually, writing this article, I actually went through all of the issues. There are just over 1,000 pages of all the Fag Rags together,
It's a lot.
which is a lot of pages.
I remember talking to John Mitchell about that, and he said that for a while there was no real conception of breaking up the text and putting some graphics in, and then you got some people in who did that, and they said, you got to break this up. It's too dense. Yeah.
No, that was very much. And earlier when I talked about someone would have an idea and they were just allowed to run with it, and I think that was one of the areas where that was true, that people could look for their own graphics to put with an article that had been submitted, and everybody made an effort to have the imagery be remotely relative or somewhat relative to the text they were laying out. But
Now,
yeah,
I'm curious, Mark or Kevin, in the early issue 1 and 2, were there discussions about what would go in, or did you just not have? Did you just print anything because
I think we printed
nobody
anything
knew what it
that we
was yet?
could.
Yeah,
There were a lot of pictures of me.
Uh-huh. And who was it that did the layout?
That's an excellent question, Michael. I don't know who did the layout, but I mean, to Mark's point, yeah, I mean, there was no editorial decision about what was going in and what wasn't going in. Obviously, you know, there had to be some limits, although I don't remember how, you know, there were a certain number of pages, and I guess we filled up the pages. There were a number of photographs, as Mark says, and there was also some drawings there, and perhaps that's what basically complemented the text on the pages.
yeah, we were.
I knew when I was there, people were doing sort of marginalia art
Mhm.
and just putting it on the sides. And it was, maybe this is just because of my memory, but I really think that it was almost all phallic. And it was pop art penises with big spurts of cum and like teardrops and things like that. And there was just like tons of that all over the place.
And by the late 70s, we actually were getting quite a volume of mail. It was pretty remarkable. I mean, there came a point where we couldn't publish all the articles that that we received. There just wasn't the room, and we needed the room for poetry because the volume of poetry was remarkable.
Yeah, and I think also by then point, the gay press nationally had evolved enough that other people were being very select. Like you just couldn't send something into the Advocate.
Right.
You pretty much couldn't even send anything into Gay Sunshine.
Right.
You know, you may be able to do it for the Philly gay news, or the Empty Closet from Rochester or something, right? But Fag Rag was open to everything, so people just knew that.
Well,
And that they could send stuff in.
the other one place that was really like that that's actually still going is RFD.
Yes,
But
totally.
they never had on. It was always in an anarchist spin, you know, aimed towards rural gays. But they took everything that anyone put in, and they're still going.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back just for a second. This is a little bit of a change of subject, but back then, consciousness raising was so important. People learned so much from one another, and there was so little that queer people could learn from bookstores and all that. Yes, in the mid 70s, later on, yes, but in the beginning of Fag Rag in the early 70s, there really wasn't much. And certainly for women, consciousness raising was extremely important, especially here in Boston, which then moved on to the national level. But Mark Human, can you talk a little bit about consciousness raising? What was it, and why was it important?
It was really, you know, important in the late 60s and early 70s, where people opened up to each other, learned from each other. You know, even in 1971 for myself, it was still like, I have to tell everyone I'm gay. And, you know, you got support for that by going to consciousness raising groups, talking about it, talking about your fears, etc. I think it changed me a lot. I learned to be more kind to myself, to listen to others, etc.
Did
I
anyone
don't
else?
know if other people experience were, but mine was great.
Yeah, it was definitely a very personal experience. I mean, it was also, it appears to be, in my perception, a product of the times, that it was important for us to really have a forum where we could express what was happening to us or what wasn't happening to us, what the experience was like of being in the closet, what the experience was like of coming out. It was very much, and it was really, I think, a very, very important. I'm wondering now if anyone has written about, the kind of whole genesis of consciousness raising, but it was very much a precursor. We weren't interested in those forums about talking about gay rights. I mean, it was very much gay liberation, personal liberation, very much expressing oneself. And also, as Mark said, sharing that with other people, it really became the glue that brought people together.
Can you
Yeah.
describe exactly what it was? That it was a living room somewhere in the Fenway or wherever, people sitting around a jug of wine. Was there a topic?
I remember the group that I went to was on Mass Avenue in Roxbury, and I don't know, there was a gentleman by the name of Roger Goodman who went by Rebel. Uh, and I'm not sure if it was his home, but we would sit around and, again, in this way that everything was not so structured, there was no leader. But again, I thought of Rebel as being a significant, you know, uh, individual personality in this place. And I don't know that there were dedicated topics. I don't remember if there were dedicated topics. I think it just kind of like, it flowed when people got together.
Yes, it was more like we got to talk. I remember there was a gay liberation house on Broadway in Cambridge or Prospect Street. I'm not
Oh,
sure what it
Prospect.
was.
Yes.
That we would meet there and have discussions that turned out to, where you could really talk about yourself, your feelings, etc.
Yeah. I think it's important to actually point out that it was obviously begun by radical feminists, but particularly in Cambridge with magazines like No More Fun and Games, right? But that it really was a reaction. I mean, it really was in some way therapy, but at the same time, it was a total rejection of traditional therapy.
Yeah.
Right, because traditional therapy back then told you not to be gay and to get married and have children. Right, so this really functioned as a really incredibly vibrant alternative to that because it was about yourself and it was about other people and it was about changing. And it was about talking about feelings and really complicated, deep, painful feelings in a group, not, and also at the same time, right, you had the rise in Cambridge and in San Francisco of like radical therapist collectives that really tried to like replace traditional psychotherapy with more progressive ways. But it really, I mean, I think we're at a stage now where, we don't have it anymore because everybody thinks they can go to a therapist and pay $180 an hour. Well, 50 minutes.
45 in Brooklyn.
But if really,
45 in Santa Fe.
I think this might be a slight diversion from the consciousness raising, but for me, it was very much part of that. And that was, if you remember on Bromfield Street, I think it was 1975, there was the Gay Men's Center. I think it was 30 Bromfield Street. And right after I came out, I was introduced to the Gay Men's Study Group. So it's slightly different from the consciousness raising of, 5 or 6 years earlier, but I think it was probably the next step from consciousness raising into sort of discussing who we were in the world.
Yeah.
And that one played a major role. And I met people from Fag Rag there.
Yeah.
I forgot about the Gay Men's Center.
Remember the Gay Men? I think it was 30
Yeah, I think I was
Bromfield.
part of starting it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Right. And all of these are really part of community building
Yeah.
on really the most basic grassroots level, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And also, I think that it's important to point out that, right, the feminist slogan was the personal is the political.
Yeah.
Because a certain amount of work has to be done internally as well as externally, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael, we've touched on gay liberation versus gay rights. Do you want to, and it seems like that's an important distinction in this group and in general. Do you want to
Yeah,
talk
no,
about
I think it's important. I mean, the history of this, right, is that the earliest homophile groups were essentially gay rights groups, and Harry Hay and people were incredibly brave doing it, but it was gay liberation that really totally broke away from the notion of working within the system. Right. So this past year I just taught a class called Power to the People, and the first class big question is, would you rather have power or would you rather have rights?
Mhm.
And of course you should have both. But it's really interesting, class of 18 to 20-year-old or 21-year-olds saying they all pretty much wanted to have power and not rights.
Yeah.
Right. But it was inevitable that gay liberation would evolve into the gay rights movement because there's nothing wrong with anti-discrimination laws. There's nothing wrong with legal protections or certainly, or equality under the law.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
but as then evolved, the impulse for gay liberation really, except for Fag Rag and some other and RFD, right, really began to sort of dwindle a bit. And
Well,
then, after gay rights made some progress, that Anita Bryant came and then AIDS came, there are issues that are very, like it was far more pressing to actually find hospital care for gay men with AIDS in the early
Mhm.
80s
Yeah.
than talk about theoretical concepts of what does it mean to have power.
Right. I want to step back once to the Anita Bryant years, because for me that was very much when things moved from gay liberation to gay rights. And my line at the time, and I stand by this, is capitalism abhors a vacuum. And so when a liberation movement starts, whether it's gay liberation or black liberation or women's liberation, eventually it becomes a market.
Mhm.
And it's happened repeatedly. I mean, it's part of American history. And the part of what happens then is that when we stop talking about liberation in that we want to change the minds of the people around us to we want to hire lawyers to pass more laws. There's never been a point where they've gotten rid of the laws that criminalized who we are. They just made new laws to make it okay to be who we are. And I always found that to be not very liberating at all, though necessary.
I think there's something mournful about going to away from gay liberation to gay rights. Um, I just thought about this movie about the Negro League that where people, black people actually loved those baseball teams.
Mhm.
And when it got lost, when black people started getting into the major leagues, something was lost. And that was similar to the way I feel about what happened with gay liberation.
Yeah, Anita Bryant was she was a convergence point. Shannon and I were both in Minneapolis when they were trying to repeal the St. Paul law. And it felt like this huge split became between the people who were the Human Rights Coalition,
Mhm.
who was trying to, get the law repealed, but it was confusing because you had to say no to the vote in order to say yes to gay rights. And Anita Bryant's people were very clear. They put out a pamphlet in black and white, and it said 10 things about homosexuals, and they will steal your children, and they will do, and then you get this very vague pamphlet from the Human Rights Coalition saying, we believe that everybody should have rights. And they never put the word gay in it. They never, so, it immediately felt like a conflict between, gay liberation that just wanted to say who we were. And I was like, put out a pamphlet with 10 points and answer all of them and be specific. And don't hide from these accusations of pedophilia and grooming and all the other crap that was being thrown out.
I
Does that
did,
make sense? Or,
yeah. And there was in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities during that time, they did a televised debate, the good guys versus the bad guys, the Anita Bryant people versus the gay rights people. And, the Anita Bryant people were, all religious people. And the people who were debating for gay rights and the protections of gay people were all straight. They didn't have one gay person on the panel.
and the committee was called the Human Rights Committee. It never
said
used the
nothing
word
about
gay in any of their
So
stuff.
we were doing exactly what gay liberation told us not to do. We were hiding who we were. And I think that was one of the greatest sins of early gay rights. The early gay rights movement is like, let's clean it up. Let's push the drag queens aside. Let's, it's all white men in business suits, the NGTF. And, it's like, I found that deeply offensive, deeply, deeply offensive as a queer from the projects in the inner city. This notion that these lawyers in business suits in Washington, D.C. were doing anything at all to help me was anathema to everything I had done the years previous. For me, that's the difference between what we were doing with gay liberation and what happened with gay rights. And again, I want to say what happened with gay rights was necessary and was, ultimately a good thing, but it was soul crushing in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think historically it's perfectly accurate to say that the gay rights movement up until fairly recently, meaning the last 15 years, is essentially a white middle class movement that actually was not welcoming to anybody who was a hippie on the outside, or Marx's notion of the lumpen proletariat. And I think just a vibrant example, right, is that Fag Rag, Gay Sunshine, Body Politic in Canada, RFD, all had from the very beginning pages about prisoners. We did prison letters, we had columns, we had encouraged prisoners to write in, we had book projects, right? And the gay rights movement never had a critique. I don't think it does now. They had a critique that gay people shouldn't be arrested and go to prison, but they never had a critique of the carceral system. Nor do they have any interest in it whatsoever. Because they were arrested and they were bad people, because only bad people get arrested.
Criminals, yeah.
Criminals. Unless of course you were gay,
deserve
and
to
that was
have male
unfair.
rape. That's the thing I get when I see on TV and they're going, oh, well, if you go to prison, you're a cute boy, you're going to get it. I mean, and that to me is still one of the major prison issues, is that there's male rape and it's not addressed. It's considered part of what you deserve if you go there.
Yeah. And a joke.
Yeah.
Would you recommend, any of you, that the liberation, that the movement going forward now in this year, is there a place for liberation movement now?
I think we're seeing it with the trans people.
Yeah.
I think the trans people are working very hard to raise consciousness, to change people's ideas of masculinity and femininity. I think it is happening, but are we cis people paying attention to it? Am I actively involved in the trans liberation movement? I have trans friends and I defend them and I socialize with them, but I'm certainly not involved in the with trans liberation folks the way I was as a white gay man during gay liberation.
Yeah, I think part of the distinction, at least as I look at it sort of historically, right, is that when people are really on the outside, you need the liberation movement. So when you look at the tactics of ACT UP in the late 80s, and the organization, which was, not anarchistic, well, they wouldn't say that, but it was non-hierarchical. And their actions were all direct actions, right? That it really harkened back to gay liberation from 1970. Right. And I
Yeah.
think when you're looking at I think it might be useful to think of the trans liberation versus the trans equality movements. Right. And trans liberation really is, people who, and we see this repeatedly, people who are completely abject by mainstream society. I mean, they just aren't even given the dignity of
Right.
choosing their pronouns. Right. And when you're then abject, you actually need to rely upon liberation because equality is not going to work. I mean, nobody in America today, the notion of trans equality is dwindling.
I'm just going to jump in really fast with one question. I'm sorry to interrupt. Last time, though, someone mentioned the idea that this has been sitting with me since we did the last one, was the idea that some of you felt, though, if non-binary and trans identities had existed in the way it does now, it would have been appealing and would have been part of the movement. I mean, I guess it sounds like there maybe is actually a through line between the queer liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, and the trans liberation movement. It doesn't, I'm wondering what the continuum is there from you, because some of you have already mentioned for last time that there is a certain quality to what you did through Fag Rag that actually feels like it kind of echoes what's happening with trans liberation now. If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, we were always, I mean, trans liberation was sort of, how to say it, it was congruent with what was going on. We knew people from Star, Marsha P. Johnson hung out in Fort Hill a few times. And so it was something we all believed really strongly in. And I mean, we all saw it in different ways. And there was that, and then there was drag, which was sort of a joke back then. And now I see drag as doing such powerful affirmations of people's identities, no matter what they're doing. But drag and trans stuff was always a part of, my first AIDS volunteer patient was a transgendered Cuban woman who lived in a working class suburb and was in the PTA, and suddenly she got AIDS and her life exploded. So there was an interplay with all of that.
Yeah, I think it.
Back then, we weren't using the language that, kind of frames, the issues for trans folks, today. I mean, but we were very much focused on gender and basically transgressing the binary. And again, it was kind of it was almost a requirement that you should wear a dress, you should put on a dress, and not necessarily act like, a woman or act like the other gender, but basically embody, this idea of masculinity versus femininity. So I think that was very much part of the spirit then. Obviously, it's different than, the depth and the whole shape of what it means to be a person who is identified, as transgender. But I think that there is the thread back there. I think it was part of a personal liberation around sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender.
Yes.
Yeah, we were all
Call it
asking each
gender
other
fucking.
how to look at it. I think, and gender fuck was a whole thing that was going on at the time.
Exactly. Yes, that was the word, gender fuck.
Also, there were movements. There was one in Boston that never came to any fruition, right? But there were other cities where, in the early years, from 71 or up to 74, maybe 5, where they tried to ban drag queens from gay pride parades because they gave a bad image.
Yeah. Yes.
I think
Right.
that
So
was
even
happening
drag
in
queens who were
Boston.
like not trans, but just what, and like often entertainers,
Yeah.
right, were seen as being too transgressive
Right.
and not middle class enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And not
Sylvia
acceptable.
Sidney was a famous Boston drag queen. Even straight people knew who Sylvia Sidney was. And Sylvia was often banned from gay pride, the gay pride parade, which I never understood, but, I was young.
Mark, did you have something that you were going to say? I think you said something I couldn't get it.
I had mentioned the word gender fucking.
Yeah.
So
Oh, okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think, and things are very different now in the entire discussion of gender and sex,
yes.
because we in the mid 70s when I came out, it was very common to refer to other men as she, oh, look at her, who's she? It was very campy, it was very much in the style of camp. And there were people who were transsexual, and there were people who were transgender, and there were drag queens. And today they they are sort of discussed as a community, or transgender and transsexual people are discussed as a single community, which it took me a little while to get used to, because I was using terminology from the 70s and ended ended up insulting people unintentionally. But I think that the language is really, really important, and this was part of the culture at Fag Rag, was the words you used to describe yourself, to describe others, was very, very important. And if somebody didn't like being called she, you didn't do it, and I don't know how to define what has happened beyond its progress, but Meyer and I both knew Marsha P. Johnson, on the edges of our lives, and Marsha is today a trans icon, and well deserved. Marsha wasn't a trans person.
Mhm.
Marsha was a drag queen. Marsha, was not transsexual or transgender, and that wasn't so important back then, but it is important now. It is important now.
Well, any thoughts that we have not covered? I do want to ask you if, and I'll give you like a couple of seconds only to think about where do you find hope when you do find hope politically? And if you don't find hope, you can say that. But anything that we didn't cover that you think people should know about Fag Rag and its effect on the rights movement, on the liberation movement, and on society?
Well,
Oh,
I'll
yeah.
jump in. I think it is it is important, and in gratitude to the History Project, that it embraces history, that it keeps history current, it keeps history alive, and allows people like us to really celebrate what happened now 50, 60 years ago. I think those things are that's important. That's very important.
Yeah, I I want to say that I find hope in the young trans people that I meet, and the young men who do not necessarily identify as women but wear dresses, who are not defined and confined by the gender roles that are predefined for all of us. I think that they are the new ACT UP. They're the new gay liberationists. They're this generation's beacon of hope.
Yeah.
They're the activists.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I see this with my students and other younger people, right? That who many were out at 14 or 15 or knew they were gay and joined a task force or other places. And there's a realization, particularly under Trump in the past 4 months and 8 years, right, that in fact, while having gay rights is really important, rights can be rolled back. They're simply laws. They're rolled back all the time, as we saw with Roe v. Wade. We see it with the cancellation of HIV research. I mean, this is all easily taken away. And I think younger people are actually beginning to see that, what they were brought up as young queer people to expect these things. they could go. I mean, the Supreme Court could literally rule against marriage and leave it up to every state. And, you know, as somebody who was never particularly gung-ho about fighting for marriage, that's a pretty terrible thing. So the question I posed, you would rather have rights than power. You want both, but you know, you really want power to be able to keep those rights. And I think younger people are beginning to see that rights are very fungible.
Yeah.
And I think we were all surprised watching this arc over the years that, I mean, so much of the trans stuff, you know, we just took for granted that this was going to evolve and develop. And I don't think any of us really thought it was all going to get rolled back. We all thought it was progress. And it's sort of, we're looking at step one for the younger generation. I can't finish my thought.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
getting
and the
old
reality is that they've been chipping it away at Brown versus Board of Education
for years.
since Brown versus Board of Education was actually passed.
Yeah, and that sense of progress that I think we all had from coming from the 60s and the 70s and stuff. I mean, I'm still just shocked that I believed in it so much that I'm this shocked at how it's all getting rolled up.
Very sad.
And I think where gay liberation has played such a positive role in today's world is that those young people who got to come out when they were 14 or 15 and who had gay support groups in their high schools, their parents are even younger than us, and they accept that there are gay people, they accept that there are trans people, they you know, and that will never be, that can't be rolled back.
Yeah.
You can roll back the laws, but you can't roll back the angry mother at the PTA meeting.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyone else before we wrap up? Well, I get hope from all of you. I think people watching this get hope from all of you because you endured at a very difficult time as well. And in many cases, we're alone in frequently in what you did. But instead of remaining that way, you forged communities. And I think as long as we have one another, there's hope too. But I get so much hope from you. I never thought I'd be talking to you guys. I'm very honored, and it's been a real pleasure. And thank you. And thank you, Matisse.
Thank you.
And thank the History Project.
Yes.
Which has been going on for how long now?
40, over 40 years, 1980.
Over 40 years.
February
45.
of 1980, the first video or film presentation was in Jacques, I believe.
Wow.
And then there was also one in Playland, not to be outdone. Playland. And it was very crude. I mean, the way that Native Americans were treated, you know, oh, they were all this or they were all that, instead of being individualized as humans in different tribes and nations. You know, we were doing our best back then too. So, but hopefully learning.
We're always learning, and I'm always very inspired and hopeful by the fact that we can always learn more. And I just want to say thanks again to everyone. Thanks, Mark Crone, for hosting this. Thank you to everyone from Fag Rag, Shannon, Michael, Maya, Mark, and Kevin. All of you, we're really, really appreciative of your voices and that you're willing to share with us at the History Project. And yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, thank you.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Do.